But, you know, I served in the House. I like the House. I like the House a lot better in the majority than I did in the minority. There's a constitution.
All right, we're going to break away from the senators in the hallway and take you back live now to the floor of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
Our society, the rights of another.
President,
The senator from California.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
So, the Senate back in session, but in a quorum call, no senators on the floor speaking. Let's take you back out to the hallway, and it looks like Majority Leader Reid, no, I think the Republicans are still speaking. Live coverage here of senators remarking on the filibuster deal.
Well, I think it's a step in the right direction that the majority has chosen not to exercise the nuclear option. We feel good about that. I think they feel good about it. So I think that crisis has been averted. We still will be dealing with controversial nominees in the way that controversial nominees inevitably produce a great debate. And all the options available to the minority remain intact. But I think if you look at the nominations of this administration, many of them have been non-controversial. You know, Penny Pritzker, the new Secretary of Transportation, the Secretary of State. But the ones that generated controversy. And so I think our reaction to these nominees will depend upon the quality of the nominees and how controversial they are.
Senator McConnell, what do you think on the timeline? Sorry, on the timeline of the NLRB nominees, are you a little concerned about that? I mean, you're asking basically the White House needs to identify.
I think I already indicated what we anticipate having on the floor of the Senate sometime before the recess are two new nominees. And we anticipate being able to vote on those before the August recess.
Senator McConnell, what consultation did you have with Senator McCain when he was negotiating this deal? And did Senator McCain basically go around you to cut this deal? And what did you do?
Well, a lot of senators over the weekend, Senator McCain among them, were involved in discussions. We talked to each other. They were talking to others. I think there was a pool of senators on our side, Senator McCain, Senator Corker, Senator Hoeven, and others, who were interested in not giving up on the prospects of working this out. And I also think that last night's discussion was critical. As I said earlier, let me repeat it. We had a situation where a huge number of senators on both sides addressed this issue. Senators actually had to listen to each other. I think the arguments that were made by my members obviously swayed at least some on the other side that maybe there was a solution to this short of pulling the nuclear trigger. So a lot of my members were involved in this over the weekend, last night. They were all helpful. Senator McCain was certainly helpful, as was Senator Corker, Senator Portman, and others. David?
Do you feel then that because of last night's discussion, there's less of a chance of ending up back in a situation like this, or did it just simply help to get out of this particular jam?
Yeah, you're asking me to answer a hypothetical. I don't know, but I do think, in spite of all of y'all's best efforts to rein on an outcome here, I congratulate you for your best efforts to try to snatch victory, a defeat from the jaws of victory. Look, I think I'm safe in saying a high level of collegiality on a bipartisan basis was achieved as a result of last night. And you can pick at it if you want to, but I think it was an important moment for the Senate, coming on the heels of the fact that we did 3 fairly significant bills this year on a bipartisan basis that were open for amendment. That's pretty extraordinary in the last couple of years. So put this down as progress in the right direction and the best possible atmosphere to go into the balance of the year when we have much tougher issues to deal with down the road. Thanks a lot.
Some of the stuff up and send to me for resume. Yeah. I'll just go read. Yeah. Thank you. That's okay.
One of the people I've learned to listen to and listen to closely is Barbara Mikulski. We came to the Senate together, we served in the House together. And here's the advice that she gave all of us a few minutes ago. Direct quote. Colleagues, no gloating, maximum dignity. So that's where I'm coming from. We had our final caucus here was very good. We're basically done everything but dotting the I's and crossing the T's to have 7 qualified nominees receive a vote for NLRB, a full functioning NLRB. It would have gone out of business at the end of this month. It won't go out of business. But this is not just about these nominees. This must be a new normal. Qualified executive nominees must not be blocked on procedural supermajority votes. I am here, been here a long time. I know that there will be times when they feel that they must do cloture, but I accept that. But we'll be able to work our way through that. The first cloture vote says it all. Richard Cordray. What a good man. He called me this afternoon after having waited and waited and waited. Here's a man who is so well qualified. University of Michigan, honor student, studied a couple of years in England. University of Chicago School of Law. That's why this very, very brilliant man was able to go to work for Judge Bork. We had a long conversation about Bork, what a good experience it was for him. Justice Kennedy, clerk for. Now, what has he done already? What has that agency done already? Already, they've collected for the American consumer $500 million, $500 million, because of credit card companies cheating consumers. That's what that agency does. Tens of thousands of people now, every day, have the opportunity to call a hotline and get information, tell this entity how they think they've been cheated. Military families are getting their homes back, having been foreclosed upon illegally. $6 million recently returned to consumers from car dealers cheating people when they bought cars. This is a watchdog of Wall Street for the American consumer. That's a vote that we just had. So we know that presidents, Democrat or Republican, deserve an up or down vote. And that's the area that we're working toward. But to be very, very clear, we think, I believe, that there's, because of what's gone on the last few days, including the joint meeting we had last night, there's a feeling around here. Now, feelings don't last forever, and I understand that. But they're not sacrificing their right to filibuster, and we damn sure aren't filibustering our right to change the rules if necessary, which I am confident won't be, but I want it made very clear. I'm very encouraged by the discussions we've had over the last few days. Both sides understand each other better. We've taken great strides to restore the comity and cooperation that used to define this great institution. It was really a good day for Ed Markey to come to the Senate and to come to this caucus. The Senate should be in a place where we engage in spirited debate and get things done for the American people. So I'm hopeful and confident this agreement will prove a major step toward achieving that goal. Now, there are lots of people that deserve credit for progress we've made in focusing how the Senate doesn't work very well. I've asked two of my junior colleagues to come and give you their opinion as to what's happened the last few years. First of all, Tom Udall. After he completes his remarks, Jeff Merkley.
Leader Reid, thank you very much, and Senator Merkley, great to be here with you and have you as a partner working side by side. First of all, let me tell you about last night, because I think that set the stage for what we saw happen here. Senator Reid, as we call him, Leader Reid, played a true leader role in that 3.5-hour meeting last night. And first of all, it was structured in such a way it was just senator to senator. But Senator Reid was tough and resolute, and he stood up and said, remember, about every half an hour he said, remember, we are going to vote tomorrow. And what flowed out of that meeting is the result we have today. And I'm proud of that result, and I think it really moves us forward. These agencies can now do their job. They play very important roles for the American people, and I think it's a good day when we have very well-qualified people take over in agencies and be able to do their job. My father, who Senator Reid had the opportunity to get to know, and they had a great visit before he died, used to always tell me that one of the most important things that
from New York.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be vitiated.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent that all future time on quorum calls be divided equally between the two sides.
Without objection.
Madam President, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Tremendously important. The other issue that I just wanted to talk about a second is what Senator Reid mentioned right at the end. And this isn't meant in any way as a threat, but we're hoping that what this is laying the groundwork for is a positive harbinger for positive things to come. And so we're looking at moving in that direction, but the leader has not given up his right to work and change precedents if the situation comes around to that. So we're all going to stand strong, but we're also going to work with each other to see that we make this a more positive place as the U.S. Senate. And I thank you very much, Leader Reid, for allowing me to be here and standing with you today. And I'll let you we will put Senator Merkley up.
It's a real pleasure to be standing here with these two partners. Tom Udall, when he came into this body, we came in together, immediately began noting how important it was that we have a regular process to restore the function of the U.S. Senate. And certainly for now, what is several years, we have been working towards a Senate that is not at this dysfunctional point that it is right now, restoring the functionality of the Senate. And during that course, we've had many occasions to be in Leader Reid's office brainstorming about how to make that possible. And I must say that in January 2011 and in January 2013, our leadership, Leader Reid, made very clear a commitment to bipartisan dialogue, a commitment to trying to restore the social contract that made this place work in the past. And what has occurred in the last few days is a reflection of how difficult that has been to achieve. But now we have a very significant moment, really a milestone on the path to restoring the functionality of the Senate. We have an agreement that says that these important executive positions will get an up or down vote. That is extremely important. And it's important because this makes a real difference in people's lives. The National Labor Relations Board is the referee for both the employer and the employees for fairness in labor negotiations. That's extremely important. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau really isn't fully in place until we have a confirmed director. In a few hours from now, we will have that confirmed director. A cop on the beat, fighting predatory practices that take advantage of working families. If you believe in family values, you've got to believe that predatory practices that strip wealth from families rather than creating wealth are simply wrong and must be countered. And we'll soon have an agency fully equipped to be that cop on the beat. You know, it's said that Jefferson and Washington were in conversation, and Washington described the Senate as a cooling saucer for the tea. This is often invoked to say that the Senate is different from the House. It's deliberative. And of course, once described as the world's best or most significant deliberative body. But we haven't had a cooling saucer. We have had deep freeze. And this event today is a significant moment in ending the deep freeze and putting us back onto a path, a functional path, to take on the big challenges that America expects us to address. Thank you.
We'll take a few questions.
Leader Reid, yesterday you said that a change in the rules was necessary to restore the Senate, and the time and the history dictated this change. You've not changed the rules of the Senate. Nothing actually changes after these 7 nominations. So what have you gotten out of this?
Well, we got a yes, and I think I should take the yes. Yes.
A lot of your members wanted to change the rules for its own sake.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
A lot of your members in your caucus have wanted to change the rules on the filibuster somewhat for its own sake, feeling that they just don't work anymore. What changed inside the room that people like Senators Merkley and Udall, who have been in favor of changing the rules, decided that this was a better course?
Well, I think you have the answer already, and that is the purpose of all this is not a question of changing this rule or that rule. The focus of what we've done, the 3 of us and others we've worked on, is to restore the ability of the Senate to function. And, you know, I've been here a long time now. I know how the Senate used to work. These 2 men with me have had a lot of experience in government. They know how the Senate should work. They're students of what's happening here in the Senate. And we've been able to accomplish that. Does that mean it will last forever? I don't know about that. But we have a good feeling with the Democrats and Republicans. I think we should, as Senator Mikulski said, not gloat, but just be dignified about it. We have a new start for this body, and I feel very comfortable with it. I don't know how I could be happier. Because, you know, we also have a few other things we want to get done. Student loans, we have talking in our caucus, we're very close to getting that done. We've got an energy bill we're trying to get to for a number of years. We're going to move to that as quickly as we can. We've got an appropriations bill. We've got a issue that I can never remember the name of it. Senator Tester pushes really hard. So we got a lot of things we need to do. And don't forget, everybody, don't forget, immigration is still ahead of us. It's a big, hard bill. And we need cooperation over here. if we're going to get something done in the House, and we're going to have cooperation here on immigration. We've not lost anything on immigration. We've gained, and a multitude of other issues.
Can you talk about Senator McCain?
Yes.
If you have these kinds of results, does this mean that you will be open to more joint meetings?
As everyone knows here, I've tried to do the joint meetings, and for reasons we need not go in here, they weren't done. We are going to do more meetings, and we're going to do them on a periodic basis. They won't be all meetings like last night. We need to have a subject to talk about. But I can envision a number of things we could be doing that would be extremely good to get us together and talk to each other rather than talk about each other. I think it would be interesting if I had, excuse me, I haven't asked them yet, but I think George Mitchell, Democrat, Trent Lott, Republican, I think that would be a great opportunity for our caucus to talk about how they view the Senate. So we're going to have more joint caucuses. We're going to try to, as I repeat, try to talk to each other than past each other.
Senator, you talked about, Senator, on the floor, you talked about Senator McCain brings his role in this process. Could this have been done without him? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Maybe. John McCain and I have worked together for a long time. I've worked with him for 31 years, and we've had some pretty difficult times together. But in the 31 years we've worked together, there is no one I have ever worked with that is more a man of his word or a person of his word than John McCain. So maybe we could have gotten it done without him, but I've answered the question.
Senator Reid, when can we...
Uh-huh.
Are you confident you'll get up or down votes on the 3 nominees to the D.C. Circuit Court?
We'll take those one at a time. We're talking about executive nominees. Those are going through the process, and we'll see.
What about Department of Homeland Security?
I could give you a few others, but you know we're going to take these one at a time. We feel comfortable where we are. I think there's a way of moving forward. I think there's a good feeling here in the Senate, the best feeling we've had in a real long time, and that's how we get things done. That's how we get things done. This was a very, very difficult issue for a lot of people, and the one thing I always had going for me, is I had the votes, and there's no need to do any more than what we've done. We took yes for an answer, which a lot of times around here it's very hard for people to do that. One more question, and I'm.
When can we expect a vote for Tom Perez?
When are we going to have a vote on the new Secretary nominee, Tom Perez? I don't know for sure because post-cloture there's a lot of time. What we're going to do is, at the right time, we will vitiate cloture on all NLRB nominees, and hopefully as early as late next week or early the following week, we will move all 5 at the same time. And then so we should be able to get Perez the next day or 2.
Senator, have you been in touch with organized labor at all?
During what period of time?
During these negotiations or recently today?
Well, I've had a call or 2. Okay, thanks.
Senator, you mentioned bringing up the energy efficiency recommendation.
So a minute ago there, you saw some of the senators. We started with the Republicans, then the Democrats talking about the deal that would avert the so-called nuclear option. A bit earlier today, the Senate voted to move forward. This is not a final vote on the nomination, but to move forward with the nomination of Richard Cordray to head up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We're told we should get a final vote on confirmation before the day is over. That vote, the procedural vote, was 71 to 29, 17 Republicans joining the Democrats to vote aye. We've been asking you all day to weigh in. Let us know what you think. You can use Twitter, our hashtag C-SPAN chat. Let's show you some of what you had to say throughout this morning. So some of your reactions to this story we're covering for you today on the Senate working out a deal apparently to avoid the filibuster nuclear option, as they call it. So we're waiting for a little more information when they, as Majority Leader Reid said, dot the I's and cross the T's. After the vote to move forward with the Richard Cordray nomination, that vote took place about 11 o'clock this morning. A couple of Democratic senators came to the floor to talk about that nomination and the process.
I thought I would just make a couple of comments regarding the activities of this chamber. A few minutes ago, we voted 71 votes in favor of closing debate on the nomination of Richard Cordray as Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. Now, the CFPB is vested with the responsibility of protecting consumers from predatory financial practices. Now, we all discovered in the run-up to the Great Recession just how important this protection is. We had many, many crazy predatory practices. On credit cards, we had fees that came out of nowhere and shifting time periods from month to month in terms of when the payments were due, and even shifting destinations of where the credit card payments got mailed to, all so the fees could be racked up on unsuspecting consumers. And certainly we found out in mortgages how important financial protection is, because we had, starting from 2003 forward, a booming industry in predatory teaser rate mortgages, where the mortgages were 4% for 2 years, and then they were changed after 2 years to 9%. Now, you would think most would-be homeowners would look at that deal and say, well, that's not a good deal. But here's what happened. They went to a mortgage broker, and the mortgage broker said, I am your financial advisor. Now, mortgages have gotten very complex and very thick, and there's lots of fine print, so you are paying me to sort through and find the best deal for you. And so our first-time home buyers, they trusted their mortgage brokers, and unbeknownst to the new homeowner, those brokers were being paid kickbacks called steering payments. They're being paid special bonuses outside the framework of the deal in order to steer the customer, the unsuspecting first-time home buyer, into a predatory loan when the first-time customer actually qualified for a prime rate, fixed rate mortgage. Well, those mortgages, those predatory mortgages, proceeded to be put into securities. Those securities were bought up by financial institutions across America and beyond, because the folks who were buying the securities understood that in a couple years the interest rate would go way up and they'd make a lot of money off those securities. So this was a system rigged against the first-time home buyer, against a home buyer who wanted to start their journey to owning their piece of the American dream. Well, those predatory practices should never have been allowed. Some here will remember. They will remember that the responsibility for consumer protection was vested in the Federal Reserve. But what happened in the Federal Reserve? Well, the Federal Reserve carried on with its responsibility on monetary policy, but it's put its responsibility for consumer protection down in the basement of their building. They locked the doors. They threw away the key. And they said, let the market be the market. They abandoned our consumers across this country. That's why we need a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that doesn't have a conflict in its mission, that's not obsessed with a different mission, such as monetary policy. We need a bureau that says new predatory techniques will crop up, and we will try to end them. Try to end practices in predatory payday loans that can charge 350 to 550% interest on unsuspecting citizens. We need
The senator from Iowa.
I ask that the calling of the quorum be suspended.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, during the debate on the budget, Dr. Coburn and I offered an amendment. That amendment would create a separate and independent Inspector General within the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. We introduced this amendment because, thanks to a quirk in Dodd-Frank, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau is the only major federal agency without its own Inspector General. And I think people know I tend to rely a great deal on Inspector General within the bureaucracy to be an independent check to make sure that laws are followed and to make sure that money is spent according to the law. Now, Dodd-Frank created the Consumer Finance Protection Board, but it did not create a Protection Board specific Inspector General. Instead, because Dodd-Frank is funded the Protection Bureau through the Federal Reserve, this Consumer Finance Protection Bureau ended up sharing an Inspector General with the Federal Reserve. This has created a problem. Right now, the Consumer Finance Protection Board's Inspector General has a split role. He serves as both Inspector General for Federal Reserve and for the Consumer Finance Protection Board. I believe this creates a great deal of confusion and obviously a bureaucratic battle for resources. In fact, the Inspector General has already had to create 2 separate audit plans. He also has had to hire employees that can oversee both the Federal Reserve and the Consumer Finance Protection Board. The end result is an office split by 2 very important but very different priorities. Dodd-Frank created the Consumer Finance Protection Board within the Federal Reserve in order to fund the Bureau without having to come to us on Capitol Hill to get congressional appropriations. That's a problem, but not a problem I'm going to deal with right now. So we had a marriage of conveniences. The Consumer Finance Protection Board within the Federal Reserve. But that board's function is very different from the Federal Reserve. Despite this, years after Dodd-Frank was passed, this unique situation remains. My concern is that if you have one Inspector General trying to cover 2 different entities, the end result is that neither gets fully overseen. In other words, we don't have adequate checks within the bureaucracy to make sure that laws are abided by and that money is spent according to law. Since the passage of the Inspector General's Act of 1978, Congress has believed that each department and each agency needs its own independent Inspector General. This has been a long-standing, bipartisan position. Currently, there are 73 Inspectors General in every single cabinet-level department and almost all independent agencies. Even small independent agencies like the Federal Maritime Commission and the National Science Foundation have their own Inspectors General. In each of these agencies, if each of these agencies have their own independent Inspector General, shouldn't the Consumer Finance Protection Board, particularly since this board doesn't have to come to Congress for appropriations, you don't get appropriations oversight, and since even some of their decisions can't even be challenged in the courts. Now, we're in this situation. The majority has opposed common sense changes like this to the Consumer Finance Protection Board. During the budget debate, when Dr. Coburn and I introduced the amendment to create a Consumer Finance Protection Board specific Inspector General, the majority would not allow it to be brought up for a vote. The position I heard over and over was that the majority did not want to relitigate in any way Dodd-Frank. I did not hear any concerns related to the merits of this proposal. Our amendment wasn't about relitigating anything. It was about creating accountability and oversight at the Consumer Finance Protection Board and doing that through an independent Inspector General, just like 73 other agencies so have that sort of checks and balance. Because the Consumer Finance Protection Board is funded directly by the Federal Reserve, there are few, if any, congressional oversight checks on the board. That makes an independent Inspector General even more important. Right now, it seems to me, since we don't discuss Dodd-Frank very often, we don't have legislation related to it, we don't have opportunities to amend, this nomination of Mr. Cordray, now before the United States Senate, is really the only tool the Senate has to create transparency and accountability within the Consumer Finance Protection Board. As we consider this nomination, I hope we will remember that and consider the Senate's role in overseeing the Consumer Finance Protection Board and what steps we can take to make the Consumer Finance Protection Board more transparent and hence more accountable to the Congress and in turn to the American people. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of applause.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
So we just heard from Senator Grassley on the nomination of Richard Cordray to head up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That final vote expected later on today. A bit earlier, a couple of Democratic senators were speaking on the subject. Let's show you that now while we wait for more senators to come to the floor.
I thought I would just make a couple of comments regarding the activities of this chamber. A few minutes ago, we voted 71 votes in favor of closing debate on the nomination of Richard Cordray as Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. Now, the CFPB is vested with the responsibility of protecting consumers from predatory financial practices. Now, we all discovered in the run-up to the Great Recession just how important this protection is. We had many, many crazy predatory practices. On credit cards, we had fees that came out of nowhere and shifting time periods from month to month in terms of when the payments were due, and even shifting destinations of where the credit card payments got mailed to. Also, fees could be racked up on unsuspecting consumers. And certainly we found out in mortgages how important financial protection is, because we had, starting from 2003 forward, a booming industry in predatory teaser rate mortgages, where the mortgages were 4% for 2 years, and then they were changed after 2 years to 9%.
Has been averted, and the Senate can now turn its attention to other matters of substance rather than internal matters of how the Senate operates. I think it's important that we evaluate how legislation that has passed this body is working. And I want to focus specifically on the Affordable Care Act, which is better known as Obamacare. Amazingly, Senator Reid on Sunday on one of the talk shows was quoted saying Obamacare has been wonderful for America. And the House Minority Leaders, former Speaker Pelosi, has said that implementation of the health care law has been fabulous. Well, that stands in stark contrast to what Senator Max Baucus, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, one of the principal Senate architects of Obamacare, has said when he told Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, that the implementation of Obamacare is a train wreck in the making. And then you contrast that with what President Obama himself said about the Affordable Care Act, about Obamacare, and he said it is working the way it's supposed to. Well, not all of those things can be true at the same time, and indeed they're not. In the real world, unfortunately, it looks like Obamacare is a slow-motion disaster in the making. And the administration, notwithstanding the President's comments that it's working the way it's supposed to, seems to be acknowledging by its own actions that it's not working the way it's supposed to. Indeed, the administration has chosen to delay the so-called employer's mandate. And they've begun to admit what Americans have now been saying since at least 2010, when Obamacare passed, that it's simply proven to be unworkable. And rather than accept the reality and support full congressional repeal of the law, the administration is instead refusing to enforce the law and is choosing to apply it selectively. The law clearly states that as of January 2014, all businesses with 50 or more full-time employees have to provide their workers with health insurance or else pay a penalty. Now, to be clear, I didn't support the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, but that's what the law says. Our Democratic colleagues, 60 of them in the Senate, and the majority in the then democratically controlled House passed the law. President Obama signed it. And that's what it says. But the President's chosen to take unilateral action and to refuse to enforce the law that he himself signed and that congressional Democrats passed without a single Republican vote. But whether you supported it or you didn't support it, many of us now are forced to acknowledge, and I would think the administration itself would be forced to acknowledge, that the law simply is not working as advertised. It's now obvious that the employer mandate has prompted many businesses to reduce the number of hours and transform full-time jobs into part-time jobs in order to avoid the employer mandate. And this has contributed to a surge in the number of people working part-time jobs for economic reasons. And that number last month alone was 8.2 million people. 8.2 million Americans who would like to have full-time work but simply can't find it, in large part because of the implementation of Obamacare. As I said, Mr. President, I voted against Obamacare 3 years ago. I remember being in this chamber on Christmas Eve at 7 a.m. in 2009 when our Democratic colleagues passed Obamacare without a single vote on this side of the aisle. And many of us were voicing concerns about the provisions of Obamacare, including the employer mandate, long before it became law. The problems with the mandate will, of course, still be there in 2015, notwithstanding the one-year delay unilaterally by the administration. And they reflect broader problems in the Affordable Care Act as a whole. Now, I believe the most common-sense thing we could do was simply to repeal it and to start over again and replace it with patient-centered reforms that actually address the biggest challenges that face most families in America. You know, the President said, if you like what you have in terms of your health coverage, you can keep it. And millions of Americans are now finding that not to be the case. The President said a family of four will find their premiums reduced on average $2,500. Actually, rather than a reduction in costs, they're finding that their premiums are going up and will go up even more when Obamacare is implemented. So my point is, whether you voted for Obamacare or not, I think it's important that we now acknowledge the sad reality is that, and it's not working the way even its most vigorous proponents wished it would, and indeed it seems to be working out a way that most of its critics thought it would. But it's important now that we work together and give permanent relief to this public policy train wreck for individual Americans and for small businesses. That's actually how we're supposed to function under our Constitution. No Congress, even under uniformly Democratic control, as the United States Congress and the White House was the first 2 years of the President's term, if things don't work out the way that even its most ardent proponents wished and hoped it would, then our job under the Constitution is to work together to try to provide some relief and solutions to the American people. So that's true whether you objected to the law in its first instance or you simply supported it. If it turns out not to work as advertised, it's our job to fix it. And we can do so by replacing it with high access, high quality care that's more affordable and it's much simpler to use, because rather than have the federal government dictate to you and your doctor what kind of care you're going to get and under what terms, you can, in consultation with your private doctor, make those decisions in the best interest of you and your family. But the bigger problem, Mr. President, is President Obama is simply deciding which of the laws to enforce and which not to enforce. And that's becoming somewhat of a trend based on political convenience and expediency. Time and time again, he's made clear that if a law that's passed by the Congress and signed by the President, whether it's him or another president, if it's unpopular among his political supporters, he'll simply ignore it and refuse to enforce it. Shortly after Obamacare became law, the administration began issuing waivers from the annual limit requirements, which made it seem as if certain organizations, oftentimes labor unions, would simply be exempted from and receive preferential treatment based on their political connections. Meanwhile, to help implement Obamacare, the IRS has announced that it will violate the letter of the law and issue health insurance subsidies through federal exchanges, especially in those places where the states have declined to issue state-based exchanges, even though the law makes it clear that these subsidies can only be used for state exchanges. So let me restate that. The law says you can only use these taxpayer subsidies for state-based exchanges, but because many states have simply said that this makes no sense for them and are refusing to create state-based insurance exchanges, these individuals will now be in the federal insurance exchange, and even though the law says taxpayer subsidies are not available for those, the IRS is papering over that provision of the law and simply disregarding it. But again, we've seen this time and time again. We saw similar disregard for the rule of law during the government-run Chrysler bankruptcy, when the company's secured bondholders received much less for their loans than the United Auto Worker pension funds, even though under the law, these bondholders were entitled to the highest priority in terms of repayment, but were subjugated to the United Auto Worker pension funds, basically in an exercise of political strong-arming. And then we saw it again in the Solyndra bankruptcy. You remember that, when the Obama administration violated the law by making taxpayers subordinate to private lenders. In other words, they put the taxpayers on the hook rather than the private lenders who helped finance Solyndra. More recently, the administration, and this is something that's in the news as recently as today, we know the administration made unconstitutional recess appointments to the National Labor Relations Board and to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The District of Columbia Court of Appeals held that the administration's argument in defense of its so-called recess appointment power would, quote, eviscerate the Constitution's separation of powers. But now it appears that as part of the so-called nuclear option negotiations, even the White House is now being forced to withdraw these nominees that were unconstitutionally appointed and offer substitute appointees. We also know that the Obama administration unilaterally chose to waive key requirements of the 1996 Welfare Reform Law and the 2002 law known as No Child Left Behind. But, Mr. President, government run by waiver or by the federal government picking winners and losers is the antithesis of equal justice under the law. You can look across the street at the Supreme Court of the United States, and above the entry it says equal justice under law. That is the very definition of our form of government, which is designed for Congress, duly elected representatives of the American people, and the President of the United States to write legislation that applies to everybody, and not to issue waivers or exemptions or to simply refuse to enforce the law because it's proven to be inconvenient or not politically expedient. The U.S. Constitution obligates the President to make sure that all of our laws are faithfully executed. And yet, with President Obama, the pattern is unmistakable. Inconvenient or unpopular legal requirements have repeatedly been swept aside by executive fiat. Now, if the law is not working the way it's supposed to, what the President ought to do is come back to Congress and say, we need to amend the law. We need to replace this unworkable law with one that will actually serve the interests of the American people. But we're not seeing that happen. We're seeing the White House decide on its own that it simply just won't enforce it. Last year, for example, the administration unilaterally announced a moratorium on the enforcement of certain immigration laws. In effect, when Congress failed to pass legislation that the President wanted, the President himself simply decided not to enforce the immigration laws. As that example shows, this administration has frequently relied on unelected bureaucrats to override the people's elected representatives. And it's simply improper and unconstitutional under our system for the President to decide unilaterally that he's not going to enforce the law. For example, when Congress refused to enact so-called card check for labor unions, the administration simply turned to unelected bureaucrats at the National Labor Relations Bureau. And when Congress refused to extend cap-and-trade energy taxes, the administration turned to unelected bureaucrats at the Environmental Protection Agency to attempt to accomplish the same objectives indirectly that it was prohibited by Congress because it couldn't get a political consensus from doing directly. Indeed, the President has now authorized the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate virtually every aspect of the American economy without congressional approval and without recourse to the American people. When we make a mistake, when we do something that the American people don't approve of, they get to vote on us, and they get to vote us out of office if they see fit. That's not true with this faceless, nameless bureaucracy, which is rarely held accountable, and particularly when the President delegates to that bureaucracy the authority to regulate in so many areas and avoid congressional accountability and accountability at the White House. Taken together, all of these measures represent a basic contempt for the rule of law and the normal constitutional checks and balances under separated powers. After witnessing the President's record over the past 4 years and a half, is it any wonder why the American people, indeed members of Congress, were skeptical about his promises to enforce our immigration laws under the immigration bill that passed the Senate recently? All of the extravagant promises that were made for border security, for interior enforcement, the implementation of a works-cited verification system, for a biometric entry-exit system to deter 40% of the illegal immigration that comes when people enter the country legally and simply overstay their visa. If after 17 years the federal government still isn't enforcing those laws that are already on the books, how in the world can the American people have any confidence whatsoever that the President and Congress can be trusted to enforce laws that it passes? After witnessing the President's performance, I just think the American people are deeply skeptical of his promise of future performance. And his selective enforcement of our existing laws undermine public confidence in the federal government. Mr. President, I believe the executive overreach that I've described is corrosive to democratic government. If a Republican president had ignored these kinds of constitutional checks, had refused to enforce laws he didn't like, refused to defend in court laws that he didn't like, and used federal agencies to flout the will of Congress, you can be sure that our friends on the other side of the aisle would be complaining nonstop about the imperial president. Yet they've largely given President Obama a pass. But whether you agree with the president on health care, on immigration, on energy policy, on card check, or other hot-button issues, we can all agree, we should all agree, that government should not be picking winners and losers, and that we urgently need to restore the rule of law and faithful execution of those laws to their rightful place in the highest reaches of the federal government. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of quorum.